Welcome to Conscious Dominance, a DSRX studio production. These weekly conversations explore how to approach mindful leadership and inner dominance within the powerful container of committed, intentional relationships. Join Eric as he invites new dialogues, sharing practical insights for how the craft of consciousness opens the aperture to love, serve, and connect with unwavering presence.
Welcome. So much of this podcast has actually not been about sex. It's been about the energy, bringing consciousness to a relationship. And I wanted to talk specifically about sex today, and specifically calling out men and whoever's the one in the masculine pole, and specifically men that are heterosexual, that we have grown up, where my first experience with sex was through masturbating. When I was distressed, emotionally distraught, I would soothe myself. And then when I began to have sexual partners, it continued. And I felt like I needed it all the time. There was a lot of unconscious patterning. It was obsessive. I would seek out comfort. It's so rampant as a model of this. When I spent time in Japan, they have a term that they talk about coming to use sex for your health. And I want to decouple sex from this notion. I was listening to a podcast with Emily Nagoski and Libby Sinback. She was saying that sex is not a biological need, which sounds really, first I was like, what? She said, sex is a motivational system. And yet when I have had the feeling inside of me that like I was literally going to die if I didn't have sex, it was such an angst feeling. And her call out was that this feeling that's so life or death, and that feeling is actually loneliness. It's actually me feeling lonely. It's actually me feeling grief, despair. She says this thing, you're not horny, you're lonely. And I think men like myself who have not been able to process emotions, challenging emotions, grief, sadness, don't have necessarily a place to connect with other people around that. We've used sex as a way to soothe and a way to feel better about those difficult, uncomfortable emotions. She says, when you are in an uncomfortable internal system and a signal inside of you, and then you're using that to seek out sex to prevent something bad from happening, we're in this distraught place, and so we're using it to feel better. And it's the water that we swim in. This is something that Rachel called me out on. It was how much, when she's comforting me in our sex, that polarity gets switched. And when we're in that mindset and in that space of like comfort sex or maintenance sex, it becomes unconscious. It is unconscious. And I think that's the thing that I want to bring consciousness. How much is our sex more of a space of unconscious behavior? I think there's this mindset, especially in heterosexual relationships, where you have to have sex frequently. There's a certain number, like a good sex life is a certain amount of sex. And it creates an obligation for one of the partners. And I think that sort of mindset, if we don't examine it, if we don't look at it, that's an unconscious patterning. We're mistaking feelings of loneliness for our desire for sex. We're using sex to satiate and connect and to feel less lonely. That's just danger. When we only have one emotional place, often we have only one person that we're connecting with, and we're not finding connection elsewhere. My own story, I realized that so much of this last couple of years, I was in pain. I was in a lot of pain, and I was in a lot of emotional pain, processing some grief, processing some trauma. And I definitely was using sex as a way to feel comforted and to feel better. And I think what's interesting is when it's coming from that place where there's two pathways in the brain, the seeking pathway and there's the rage pathway. The rage pathway is also the grief pathway. We are either in the seeking energy where we're going towards something because it's pleasurable, or we're actually trying to avoid something. And I think that men, I know for me, I've wanted to avoid something. I've wanted to avoid feeling something. I wanted to avoid feeling discomfort. So I've used sex to feel comforted. The situation with that, though, is that when we're doing it from that pattern, our sex becomes monotonous. And I think so often why so many heterosexual relationships, they may have lots of sex, but it's pretty much the same kind of sex. It's because of unconscious grief or unconscious rage, unconscious feelings that he doesn't know how to process or to feel. And so he's using the sex as a way to comfort himself. But when he's in that state, it takes away the play or the creativity or the seeking, because you can't be in both of those at the same time. And so I think when we get stuck in a kind of monotonous way of being, it's often because we're unconsciously actually feeling a lot of grief or actually feeling a lot of pain. And we're using sex as a way to satiate that. And so we're actually lonely. We need connection. Humans, a human baby will die from a lack of connection. And there's studies that say that loneliness is worse for you than smoking cigarettes. It is a fundamental human need to connect. And if we have a woman in our life, especially if you're in a DS dynamic or some kind of dynamic where that woman is there for you, be very careful that you don't use her as a comforting place in your life unconsciously, and that there's these patterns where you just start using her like a comfort pillow, like your blankie, like your pillows. That's a dynamic that if you bring consciousness and you're doing that, and that's fine, but be aware that's what you're doing. Be aware that you're using her from this mindset, from this grief, from unconscious patterns. And I think, what is it to bring sex out of this place, out of that kind of syrupy, soupy, emotional place, and kind of get it into another place? This is where I love the word play. This is where I love curiosity. This is where having a beginner's mind, having humility, having these other frequencies and energies is the escape valve. This is how you get to another place. You start really being interested in your pleasure and her pleasure, and you start having empathy for her and where she is and what's happening in her body. And you start hosting her experience. And it's not about just you needing just to feel comforted. And you're not trying to just prevent something from happening, but you're actually interested in her pleasure. You're interested in her body and her frequency. And Rachel called me out on this because she is sub through and through. She's very submissive. And so we got into, I'm going to call it a rut, a pattern of just very similar sex, very monotonous sex through these periods when I was in a sadder place. And it was helpful, but it's easy to get stuck there because it's easy and it can be lovely. But I think so many relationships and so many men, we do this without even knowing that there's another way of doing it. And the way out of it is to bring awareness to it, to bring consciousness to it, to bring presence to it, to take responsibility for the situation, start looking in the mirror, start examining yourself. And I think this reminds me of when I was in grad school and I was making a lot of art. And I remember just filling up my studio with all this art. And one day, there was one of my critiques talked about this wonderful advisor. And she said, what do you think about just not making any art for a little bit? Just take a break, just stop. And there was something in the way she said that I was like, you know what? I'm going to take that all the way. I'm going to take that extreme. So I literally, instead of just stopping making art, I said, I'm going to stop being an artist. I'm going to literally take everything out of my studio, clear it all out. And I'm just going to go to the studio. So I cleared away all the art supplies and I just would go there and show up to this empty room. And I just was like, you know what? I'm just going to show up. That's my job. I don't even know what making art means anymore. I don't even know what being an artist is. I'm just going to show up to this empty room and just ask the question and just be in this unknown space and not make anything or do anything, just thinking or being bored and just not take a phone, not take anything to write, nothing, just show up. And it dawned on me, I was like, this sucks, but it's also really, there's something about this that's really powerful. But the whole experience redefined what art was for me. I was stuck in this notion that art was making something and art was like creating something. But what if art could be a way to provoke thought and conversation? And it didn't necessarily have to look like art. It could look like a surveillance footage on that whole thing could be art. But it got me dislodged from the habituated notions that I had of what it was to make art. And I bring this up because I think we all need to go on these journeys with sex. Stop having sex, maybe stop having intercourse as sex, and maybe make a rule for yourself. Say, I'm just going to stop, and then just be curious, and then play and just do other things, and maybe just create energy and dynamic. And there could be other situations and scenarios that could be very much sexual, but get away from thinking that DS is about sex or about intercourse, and that it could be something completely different. That there's so much possibility that's out there, and we get stuck in these sort of monotonous ways of what it is to be sexual. And I, even someone who's outside the box and very sexual and understand all these things, I get stuck in these ruts. And especially when I'm in these emotional, painful places, I have found that I'll get stuck in maintenance sex. And that maintenance sex, when the woman is the provider of comfort, she becomes the host of the experience. The polarity is getting switched. And recognize that, and how much of sex is the polarity being switched in this other place. I think entitlement's an interesting word. I think entitlement to me feels like unconscious power dynamics. And I think when we have unconscious power dynamics, we're not inviting, there's a lot more that's possible when we bring consciousness into the play. I think, how much are we living out patterns that are prescribed to us? How much are we living out like what we think a DS relationship should look like, or what we think sex should be, or what we think power dynamics should be? And we get stuck in a rut. And to bring consciousness to it is to examine it and to look at it. And in order to really look at something kind of afresh, we have to stop, we have to pause, we have to look at it. We take a break and utilize these times to look at the sex. Did this whole thing called the Whole30. And the whole point of it was to really look at our eating habits and to take away certain things and then eat from this more kind of clean way. And then after the 30 days, you systematically reintroduce these foods. And what I found in this experience was that there was a lot of unconscious eating that I had been doing, and that there were certain things that were supposedly healthy that were actually, like cauliflower, very unhealthy for me. I bring that up because the Whole30 is really taking inventory of your food, where you cut out experiences to bring more consciousness. Take inventory of your sex and take inventory of your desires. Maybe it's something you might like. Don't put yourself in this little box. Let yourself be open to other things. And I think this is why heterosexual men, especially, we get really limited in what's possible, because we haven't had to examine our life. Because part of why, what the patriarchy is, or when you're in privilege, is you don't have to examine your life. The problem with that, though, is you don't ever fucking bring consciousness to it or examine it. And you're not actually living from all the possibility that's out there for how you could live. And so you become a victim of your own thinking of what you think you are, because you never had to actually examine it. And so that you're conditioned and you don't actually look. And so I think a lot of why I was looking at this study, Emily was saying that heterosexual relationships may have a lot of sex, but they're not having as many orgasms. One of the people is not having pleasure, and there's not as much variety. And I think the whole point of why a DS dynamic or any of this is to expand what's possible and to move into a place that brings consciousness, authenticity to what you actually want to do and experience. Is you got to see what's out there, what's possible for yourself, and bring curiosity to that experience and to that journey. See, the rage grief pathway in the brain, it was in the book Master of Change, Brad Stulberg. In that book, he talks about this, the seeking pathway versus the rage pathway. And he talks about it as a way to get out of reactivity. And I think I want to call out too, that there's a low grade where we always think it's like, it's just like we're triggered, but it can also be just we're sad and we're in grief, or we're like low simmering rage. And then we're dominating from that space, or having sex from that space. That's going to limit what we think is possible. And so if we want to expand what's possible, we have to actually acknowledge that we are feeling these things, get help for them, find the connection for them. We can't just ignore it, resist it. And then naturally we'll bump over to the seeking pathway and to this more curiosity pathway and this other humble pathway. That's going to be our natural place. Emily said that sex is actually part of the innate motivation system. And that when we think it's life or death and we're in this obsessive place with sex, it's often because we're in the other pathway. And it does feel like life or death because connection is life or death. And obligation. When a woman's having sex from obligation, that's also a call out. Even if she's your honey, your sub, but she's doing it because she feels like she should, and she's there, and it gets in this rut. Start paying attention to her and what she's experiencing, and you could feel it in her and see her. A woman in her feminine wants variety. She wants change. She wants to feel different sex at different types of the month. You're working with someone who's alive in these different spaces. And so the sex just becomes the same kind of monotonous thing. Talk to her, ask her, be willing to listen to her, be willing to look at yourself in that space and be like, wait, whoa, there's a lot of unconscious sex here. We've been falling into these patterns. I think about Steve Jobs, stay humble. What was it? Stay foolish, and stay curious was in this talk that he gave. David Foster Wallace gives this great little snippet about this is water. You've got these two fish and they're swimming along. And then another fish comes up to them and says, hey boys, how's the water? And then the boys look at each other and the one guy goes to this, so what the hell is water? And the notion is you don't know what you're in. And I think a lot of heterosexual men, we don't know the water that we swim in, and that we're confined and contained in this sense of what it is to be a man. And the dominance that I speak of when I'm on this is more about consciousness. And the word dominance is important though, because it comes back to that. And what I mean by that is that we actually are our own authority, our own interior authority, author. We are our own dominant being inside of ourselves. We need to step into our internal dominance and not let the world condition us, not let our woman condition us, not let anyone condition us. From that frequency of inner dominance, we can be in a relationship fulfilling the dominant role. But if we are going out and we haven't done the inner work, the dominance that we're doing is going to be narrow. There's going to be a narrow bandwidth of what we think that dominance looks like. And we're going to be confined unconsciously by what we think dominance is. And dominance actually can be something that's so much broader and bigger than that. And part of that is to infuse it with creativity, what's possible that hasn't been done, but it's also maybe just playful. Maybe it's silly. Maybe it's like using things from one context over here that's normal over here, and then we apply it to the bedroom. You overlap it. Then all of a sudden, it's a different thing. And I think that dynamic is where you can then have sex from that kind of place. If you can own the frame of it and bring fantasy into it or bring some consciousness to it. I'm not saying you can't have sex when you need to feel better, but just know that's what's happening and bring a frame around it. I remember being in strip clubs and seeing how many of the men were there just talking and using these women as therapists, just being comforted by them. And you were allowed to be yourself. Emily Nagoski says this wonderful thing about ask yourself, what is it that you're wanting in sex? So much for me of what is attractive about Rachel and the DS and the whole experience is that for the first time, all of me could be here. All of my kinkiness, all of my sexuality and the desires, my fantasies, they were allowed, they were accepted. Like, I am allowed to be my full self. I'm allowed to have the full expression of me, the monster in me, the killer in me, the sad little boy, the whole range of it, all of it's allowed and it's there. And I get to steward these different characters that are inside of my head. And I think this goes back to something that Emily spoke about. If you have two couples and one couple is having lots of sex, but one of the people's doing it out of obligation and is a rut with it, versus another couple who's having less frequent sex, but it's super dynamic, super fun, super exciting, great orgasm, all the things. Which one would you rather be in the situation of? I would rather be in the situation where both people are really into it than the one that's just like the routine of it. And it got me thinking about food too. If we are unconsciously just eating kind of crappy food, fast food, and just consuming and mindlessly eating versus bringing some intentionality to the food, where this is where like the whole slow food movement and like fast food versus slow food. And so fast food, there's a ethos around that. It's just there, it's just quick, it's unconscious, you're just eating it, versus slow food where there's more mindfulness and more attention and more pleasure. It's more about the pleasure of eating and the pleasure of the experience. The same with sex. Like, can it be more about the pleasure? And that the pleasure of the dynamic is not just about just sensational pleasure, but it's also psychological pleasure. It's stepping into our power, stepping into this other kind of space and experience. When you're part of the patriarchy, you don't have to look at yourself in the mirror. You don't have to look at the water that you're in. That's entitlement. You don't get to be the author of your life. If you want to be the man, the dominant, essentially, that's what this is, right? DS. I'm talking conscious authority. Then you've got to examine the patterns of it outside of the bedroom. Like, you got to examine how are you just fulfilling some form that's prescribed to you on the other side of it? And what is it to be in this other place? I just really thank you, Emily. Shout out, appreciate you for calling out men that are using sex unconsciously just as a place of connection and as a place to just soothe themselves, and as a place because we're feeling lonely or feeling grief. And shout out to Brad Stolberg's Book of Change too, where the seeking pathway and the rage pathway, and how we can't be in both at the same time, and how one opens up possibilities and the other one sort of narrows possibilities. And so if we want to open up possibilities, we need to get into that seeking pathway and be curious. If you want to just have robot sex, there is AI. We're going to be able to create that. Thing about that though is however your patterns are right now, they're going to just stay, and you're not going to have to examine yourself. You're not have to up level. Sex will not be a place for you to grow. And over time, it's not going to be that regenerative quality. And you're going to miss out on the opportunity for sex to be something that is a powerful alchemizing quality. The sex for me right now is something, and this dynamic, that is powerfully alchemizing my emotions. It's a powerful place for me to feel chi, to feel younger, to feel more vital, for my cock to feel no refractory period anymore. It's just hard. It's just always going. It's on. And that comes from the work, from the alchemy, the alchemizing of my energy, of my space, of my feelings and these emotions. And it comes from this awareness. It's not from just unconsciousness and from this grief and from this sadness. And I could see when the sex is from this place or it's from this place. And owning those moments, that's the dynamic. That's the conscious dominance. Dominate the moment, dominate your frequency and your rage and your emotions. You got to honor it though. It's not a dominance in the sense of resist and then what you resist persists. It's more of you got to be able to accept it, but then transform it, alchemize it. You really want a powerful, alchemizing relationship. Be in love with your woman. Be in love with the person you're with. Care about her. Be in your empathy with her. Be in your compassion with her. Be in your feeling of your authenticity with her. The whole point of conscious dominance is the power plot, which I would call the authenticity, the power to be yourself. It's not power over, but it's the sense of your own internal power, plus being compassionate, plus being empathetic, plus the two together is the equation. Conscious dominance equals power plus compassion. Conscious dominance equals power plus conscious empathy. It introduces serendipity. It introduces a lot of layers that lead us into a place of mystery and mysticism and opportunities for profound depth and grief, where grief becomes sexy and beautiful, and where our pain and our emotions and our feelings are not something that we have to avoid, but that we can like lean into and really marinate in them. And for all the men out there and women, everybody, don't be afraid to feel. It's not necessarily going to act from them, but if we can not resist these feelings and actually be in the feelings, this is what Arosha is about. This is what the Mudroom is. Check out the Mudroom. It's an incredible course that's been a wonderful place to deal with emotions and our feelings. She has a great metaphor of the Mudroom where you go from the outside into a room where you knock off your snow and take your boots off and the mud and all the shit. And then you go into the house. It's this in-between room. The idea is that when you go into the mudroom, you knock off the feelings and then you go into the house. You deal with your emotions, your feelings, and then you enter clean with your woman with a consciousness. I go through my mudroom and then come back clean. That's what we need to do with our women. Bring that awareness, that level of consciousness to the situation. And I think the mudroom is a great tool for dealing with grief, for dealing with sorrow, with dealing with the emotions that are below the line, so to speak. It's not just about you and your ego, but it's about the relationship. It's about her. It's about your own inner child. This is leadership. This is being a good team captain. I'm a Chiefs fan. And one of the things that I really appreciate about Mahomes is that he looks in the mirror and he takes responsibility. He doesn't throw his guys under the bus. He takes responsibility for himself, for his mistakes. He's like, how can I do better? I heard Andy Reid, the coach, just recently talk about how he came to him after the Super Bowl and was like, hey, tell me how I could do better. That level, that degree of always wanting to learn and be better. This is the same kind of quality that LeBron James has, that Tom Brady has, that these guys that are there for the long haul, that keep getting better. This is Federer in tennis. He completely reinvented himself. You got to be able to be a beginner again and bring that kind of attitude to sex. Bring it to sex. Don't let your vision of dominance and just to be a man not allow you to be humble, not allow you to be curious. You got to get over to the seeking pathway. Don't think that just because you want to be dominant and you want to be a leader and you want to be in charge means that you can't ever be humble. You can't ever be curious. You can't ever be the fool. You can't ever be a beginner. The way forward is by being humble, by being a beginner, by learning, by growing. That's how we stay young. That's how we stay innovative. So don't get stuck in unconscious sex where we're just having it because it's soothing. We get into these safe relationships with our women, and then all of a sudden we feel comforted by it. Find a way to get that met elsewhere, whatever it is that can fill our interiority. So we're not going to her always to soothe us unconsciously. We're needy in that energy. We're needy. You got to go through the mudroom, get in your power so you can host her. You can be the one to shepherd her. You can be the one to steward her and not always make it about you. It's about hosting her in her experience. Diversify. If you're an investor, you don't want to just put your money in one thing. Don't just put all of your emotional needs into your woman. Diversify. Nature is an awesome place to go and feel, right? Listen to music that makes you feel and feel. Put a song on and cry and feel rage or feel sad or feel like allow yourself to feel the shit. Music is an exceptional way of doing that. Again, I'm going back to Arosha, but so much of what the Arosha movement practice is about is allowing yourself to be in your feelings and then to move from that place. It's something that's been really helpful for me too, is to actually move my body from the place of my feelings. So when I'm in grief or I'm in rage, I allow myself to fucking move in that space and just like in the dark or whatever I'm doing, I'm going through, I'm in this place of feeling it. That's when you start getting in your body and the stuff gets released. And that's why I can move my body and I just have that energy because I allow my feelings to move through me and to be in that space. And I don't get self-conscious in that space. But Rachel's got a whole practice, Dark 40. It's free. Check it out. It's about dislodging your creativity, dislodging the way that we do life. She's doing it for 40 days. It's also coincides with Venus, the planet's retrograde motion. It goes into an apparent retrograde for 40 days, where it moves from the evening star to the morning star. That switch symbolically is an opportunity for us to re-examine that part of ourself, our feelings, our emotions, these other parts of ourself, and look at ourselves and our feminine from a different perspective. That's another great tool that could be utilized here. Do research, be curious, smell, feel, sense, see what turns you on in movies and power dynamics. They could be great tools. See what you're interested in, what's possible, what's out there. Don't get stale. Don't get unconscious. Your vulnerability is not a problem. It's actually a pathway. It's actually a part of the solution. These feelings that we're having, they can provide a place for us to feel healing. When we need to come up with creative ways to do sex and do other things, lean into the thing that we think is the problem. Lean into the feelings. If you've got some grief or some pain or something, like you kinkify it, like turn that particular feeling into something that you want to actually lean into and even feel a little bit more, accentuate it, lean into it all the way, hold some space for it, go there, create a scene around that. It's going to be powerful to transform you. You won't be the same person after that. So much of the sex that's out there, the women, why they're not getting aroused, why they're turned on, is they're actually having to be up in their head. They're performing. Get them out of their head. Get them out of their head. Give them an experience. Host it. Take care of everything so that they can actually have this experience. Take care of their life before, during, and after the sex. It's not just, it's the aftercare, but it's the before care. It's the chore play. It's an art. It's creative. It's fun. It's play. It's healing. It's what Tantra is. It's the template of what conscious sex can be about. Thank you for listening. Reach out to me. I'm always here for a chat as a coach. Go check out the Dark 40. Go check out the Mud Room. Check out Rachel, what she's up to with Arosha. Thank you. Appreciate you.